I'm Nick Hernandez, and you're listening to the Positivity Matters podcast, where we have conversations with scholars, community leaders, and others that focus on well being, positive psychology, and human flourishing. Carol Graham is a senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at Brookings, a College Park professor at the University of Maryland, and a senior scientist at Gallup. You've had a fascinating journey from economist to a person who is bridging over into psychology. Tell us about this journey.
Well, I'm still an economist, but I like working with psychologists and also public health professionals, medical professionals, because all of them are now involved in the new science of well-being. I fell into it by mistake, honestly. I'm part Peruvian and I was working on development economics for the first half of my career on poverty, inequality, public health issues. And I was doing surveys of low-income people in Peru who were coming out or not of poverty, like looking at income mobility. This is in like the late 1990s, early 2000s, when there was a lot of debate about how whether globalization was good or bad for the poor in poor countries. Turns out it was pretty good. It was better for the poor in poor countries than, in the end, a lot of workers in industrialized countries. But that's another story. But what I found was an incredible amount of upward income mobility among the poor in Peru during that period. And I thought, given what everybody's saying in the protests outside the World Bank, I wonder how they think they've done. And it turned out that over half of the people who had done the best, meaning that had the most income mobility, said their situation was bad or very bad compared to the past. And I thought that was weird. And that poor people, particularly poor rural people, said, oh, it's the same or better. But it often because they're less invested in the income economy and they focused on their their crops. How did they did that year or whatever. But mainly, I was very confused by these findings. So first, we repeated the survey a couple of times. We thought maybe we'd done it on a bad day, a day Chile beat Peru in soccer,
Mm.
or something like that. But we kept getting um, the same results. And so at that point, I realized it was a nascent study of happiness, the kind of the initial concept that we used before well-being, the study of well-being got more sophisticated, and it involved economists like Richard Easterlin and Andy Oswald of the UK. Richard Easterlin was the first modern economist to study happiness. I know Adam Smith did ages ago, but in any event, and Danny Kahneman, little known psychologist. So it was a very small group, and I was just lucky. I was at Brookings at the time, like I am now. Um, and we held some meetings and had, people had this group come. And, at first, economists were very skeptical of us. They thought we were nuts, really. We were working with psychologists. We were looking at non-income determinants of human behavior and human welfare. We were departing from the kind of very quantitative, rational actor revealed preferences mode about how economists assume people behave. Um, and we were getting findings that seemed pretty radical, like money matters, but only so much. We still know that, right? If you're destitute, you're going to have lower levels of well-being if you can't feed your kids or whatever. But after a certain point, it's more, what your life is like, what you've chosen to do. And, again, means and money matter. If you don't have enough means, you can't choose the kind of life you want to lead. And then we've also been able to uncover and also attach kind of a relative value to things like volunteering, having meaning and purpose in your life, which turns out to be incredibly important to well-being. Health turns out to be much more important to well-being than income, although the two often go together because it just, on average, people with higher levels of income, particularly in this country, get better health care. Um, but, and things like social friendship, social ties and friendships matter a lot. That comes in very big in the well-being equations. And also the other thing that matters is freedom, like freedom to choose and freedom to live in a democracy, that without a doubt, people who live in democracies are much, much happier and have higher levels of all kinds of well-being, all kinds of dimensions than people who don't, for kind of obvious reasons. It's kind of hard to choose the life you want to lead if you're in a situation where you can't even choose or help choose the government that governs your country. So anyway, that's how I fell into it. And I continued working on developing countries for about 10 years after that, because nobody had done the work on well-being in the developing countries. It was
Hmm.
assumed that they were different because they were more poor and income would matter more. And so the determinants of happiness, life satisfaction, other dimensions of well-being couldn't be the same. Well, it turns out they're exactly the same as long as people aren't in destitute poverty. So, intellectually and policy wise, eventually, was able to use my economic skills, but in a field that was very different. And now we even have, biologists and other medical people in the medical profession looking at things like the role of genes or a whole bunch of things so it's become a really exciting, field with economists, psychologists, geneticists, you name it. And I think and it has something to contribute to our standard measures of progress of people, how we assess people's quality of life, all sorts of things. But in about the year 2015, roughly, I started studying deaths of despair in the United States, which also sort of happened by mistake. Lots of mistakes in my career, I guess, but it's been interesting. I kept coming back from Latin America, where I do most of my work, not only when I work in developing countries, but I was like, what is it about being poor in the US that's so depressing? It means because the poor in Latin America are so much more hopeful, and I've measured this. I mean, actually in Gallup World Poll data. Um, and it turns out that the hope differences in levels of hope between the poor and the rich in the US are 20 times bigger than they are in Latin America, which is not a region known for its equity, right? This is crazy. And so I really started to look more into this to try and understand what was going on. I mean, of course, one ingoing assumption is it's very hard to be poor in a rich land, and it's even harder to be poor in a rich land where the national psyche basically says, if you work hard, you get ahead, and if you're poor, you didn't work hard enough. By definition, you're kind of a loser, and very individualistic. And it's served us well in many ways. It's sort of the American dream um, story, but it's falling apart in lots of ways. And I think because in part the technological and other changes in the economy have really made it much more difficult for low skilled workers to continue to have good stable jobs. And we also have kind of a more extreme levels of inequality than we've ever had, and a reduction in intergenerational mobility. And all these things matter to this, oh, if you work hard, you get ahead. Well, doesn't really work anymore. Um, so it turned when I got one thing that struck me is I was looking at the racial gaps in the well-being metrics in the US. And I was doing this at a time of the Ferguson riots in St. Louis, the Freddie Gray murder in Baltimore, a time there was a lot of concern about the African American community, violence and everything else. And I got these findings that I first thought were a coding error, but they are very persistent and very robust, which is that low-income African Americans were 3 times as likely to be higher up on a hope scale than low-income whites. And Hispanics, which didn't surprise me, I'm from Latin America, it's an optimistic place, weren't as high as low-income African Americans, but they were definitely higher than whites. So I
Hmm.
started poking into this, and that's when I uncovered these, that hope levels among low-income whites were the lowest in places that had lots of deaths of despair, declining manufacturing places, declining communities, all kinds of stuff. So and then, it tracked with the sort of trends that Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who first coined the deaths of despair term, were finding in mortality rates, right? And so it was one thing that I've since worked on is how if we'd been tracking these things earlier, we might have been a little bit better prepared to deal with what is a crisis of, early preventable premature deaths. It's now lowered our life expectancy consistently since 2015. And we did find in our overtime data that despair preceded the increase of deaths of despair in most counties where a lot of them occurred. So
Mm.
again, tracking well-being metrics is cheap and easy. Um, Dealing with a crisis of suicide and overdose rates is pretty hard to get in at the other end of it, right? It's too late for, a whole generation, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I, I can't help but think that if the focus shifts on building hope, maybe even I was kind of thinking along the lines of like for school, like what if part of the point of school could be to learn about hope and then have this thing that we're doing reconsider it as a potential place in which hope building is part of the point of the thing itself.
I totally agree with you. And actually, the UK has an amazing initiative called the Be Well Initiative. It's in the District of Manchester, in about 400 of their public schools. So the majority of schools in the district, for sure. It's a very large district in kind of the deprived regions of the UK, the Northeast, which is kind of very much like our hollowed out heartland, the kind of deindustrialized places. And they teach in schools as part of the curriculum with community support. So the parents are, every community has discussions about this, whether they want the program in their schools or not. So the parents don't feel like, weird things are being imposed on their kids like they do here. And they learn things like self-esteem, how to deal with bullies, how, they learn, um, they learn, kind of the foundations that will help them, have purposeful, meaningful, hopeful lives in the future. And it turns out if they evaluate the program, like, after 3 years, the first evaluations, the kids not only had higher levels of reported well-being, but also better academic performance. So it's not taking away from their academic performance, it's helping. Um, and the other thing, before they design the curriculum, they had a very large scale survey of kids in the district. So understanding what their concerns were what made them, feel helpless, or what made them unhappy, or, how lonely were they. Um, the UK also has a really effective national campaign to combat loneliness, and it has very different strategies for different age people. Like the elderly almost always are by definition more likely to be lonely because their spouses died, some of their friends have died. Um, I mean, there's still a very much a kind of, whether it's character traits or genetics, there's some people are just by definition lonelier and more introverted than others. But what their main strategies for older people are to get them out into the community, right? Like being alone in their house is not really, and so it might be through volunteering, it might be through, you know, community walks in the park, it might be through participation in the arts. We talked about therapeutic arts earlier, and it's kind of like that. It's very different for kids. I think the strategies in school, I mean, there's a lot of debate about how much does social media matter, and I don't think social media is the root cause of all this, but it certainly doesn't help. And what most of the studies find, I think there's more consensus on that, is that it's not just social media per se, because that's kind of a fact of life right now. But the kids who are the loneliest, the kind of worst off in lots of ways, spend a disproportionate amount of their time on social media. So,
Um,
it's like kinds of understanding things like that as part of, what they are doing in schools at the level of young. And then the other thing I think that there's some examples of here and also in the UK and other countries is this something else we talked about earlier, which is the role of mentorship and that, young people are facing very uncertain futures. It's just labor markets are changing, the plates are shifting, the tectonic plates dramatically. AI is still looming. There are a couple of big wars going on. Young people are much, much more concerned about climate change than older people, justifiably. They're the ones that are going to be alive when a lot of these things happen. Um, and so mentoring, I think, is really important to kind of say, it helps keep hope alive, right? Because um, hope, as we've also discussed, is what distinguishes hope from other well-being traits, and indeed from just plain raw optimism, which is just the belief things will get better. Hope has agentic properties, right? It's a belief that you can make your life better or those of others better. Um, but if you just, agency is important, but you also need a pathway. After a while, if there's no path for getting there, it's really difficult. So mentorship can really be important in sort of making choices, kind of providing some just, backing for aspirations, somebody to talk to as you're going through the process. Um, and and what's interesting in the surveys I've done is the mentors aren't always the parents. It can be a grandparent, it can be somebody in the community. It's just whoever the kids feel confident talking to and is receptive to them, I think is really what matters. It's not the relationship.
yeah, yeah, that is something that I am a huge fan of, the idea of mentoring, especially youth mentoring. And I'd seen a suggestion from a well-being researcher, Stephen Post. He found that between an hour to three a week of volunteerism is conducive to greater subjective well-being. And I've seen some specific research on the effects, additional positive effects for communities from the mentoring. And so my little twist would be, and have like some portion of that, your dose of volunteerism be dedicated to youth mentoring. So if people are
That
looking for
seems
a
pretty
happiness,
obvious, right? It seems pretty obvious, right? That's I mean, there are other needs for that same volunteering, but I think particularly now, I think as we're facing, a lot of uncertainty and mental health problems among youth, I mean, it's time to wake up and recognize not just the problem, but there are things out there like mentoring that can make a huge difference.
yeah, we the Northeast neighborhoods in Lincoln, we had a convening of neighborhood associations with the police force, and they were going over all the statistics. And some people expressed great concern about the things the kids are doing these days, and what can we do about it? And I volunteered the suggestion, volunteer to mentor.
Go figure. Do something about it. Don't
Yeah.
just talk about it, right?
Yeah. Well, I know you're familiar with all the various well-being frameworks. I have a summary of what I can tell is covers most of them. It is Happy Life as an acronym: health, aesthetic experience, play, pleasure, yes saying. That's probably the most convoluted one because I needed something with a why, but
Oh, okay.
basically, what
Yes,
values do we
meaning
say
and
yes
purpose.
to?
Yeah.
Web of life, information, synonym for knowledge, friendship, and engagement, or that flow state. Yeah, so I'm hoping it's an easy way, as if people get interested in, the hope, and certainly there's the practical dimensions of it. And for those that feel inclined to engage in the studious part of it, I wanted to make it as easy as possible to sort of have some mental architecture as you poke around the well-being literature. This is the best I've been able to come up with.
It's spot on. I mean, I might put the meaning and purpose in bold because I think all those other things matter. But what I have found in, my sad side of my work on Deaths of Despair is that people have lost meaning and purpose. They've lost the narrative
Mm,
of their lives. And I don't think until you're able to restore that somehow, um, they will take pleasure in a lot of the things that you are talking about, or have good health, or good physical and mental well-being, appreciate life. They're in despair. So, how we restore that is it's very difficult, and but I totally agree with this list. I think it's a good way of describing positive well-being. I think we also have to think about a difficult challenge is how do we restore any of those things in the large numbers of people in despair in our country. And I think and we're seeing youth now start to join those ranks. So I think we should be concerned. I think we should focus on things like mentoring. Um, I think your school's idea, I totally agree with it. I describe the UK program all the time. And what's really good about it is it's exactly what you say. You said it should just be part of the thing, right? And they're benefiting from it. The evaluations show that. We're very aligned here, which may be a bit boring, but it should be it's just part of, it's like how we measure progress. Our national well-being is part of that. And we found out very quickly during COVID, when people's health goes and their mental health goes, guess what? Your productivity goes down. There's more studies in the, at least in the economics literature on subjective well-being, about higher levels of life satisfaction and other positive measures of well-being being linked directly to higher levels of productivity. And some corporations have bought into it probably as much an optic as anything else, but it's again you got to start somewhere.
yeah. Would it be I've heard of greenwashing. Maybe there's a corollary here. Do we have like happiness washing with
Happiness
corporations
washing,
now?
there you go. Something like that, yes. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it filters down, and maybe it's sort of, at some level, if you think your company cares about your well-being, you're more likely to stay there and work there. And maybe that over time the norm changes. Kind of like it took norms to shift to nobody smokes anymore, not many people. Nobody smokes in public places anymore. And part of it is just the norm changed. After a lot of resistance, it took time. And now it just becomes totally normal. I mean, I saw something that showed that some airlines are taking down the no smoking sign and button because you can't smoke on them. So why would you have smoking times and not? It's just, and so I think that gradually what happen with well-being is it becomes more and more um like first it's going to be a concern before it's probably seen as a positive thing. Right now it's a concern because we're very worried about youth mental health and everything else, but um I think over time it will be it will be very weird, for a big company not to have something in their policy about worker well-being.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not there yet. I'm far from that. We're
Yeah.
probably more at the happiness washing stage, but
I do appreciate the distinction that Corey Keyes made with a positive mental well-being, and that the absence of mental illness doesn't mean that people are doing well. Rather, they could be in the state that he describes as languishing. I think you've put your finger by your work on hope on the thing that moves that needle for individuals, organizations, and communities towards the flourishing end of the positive mental well-being side of life. And I think that's really powerful and something that can bring um, large swaths of a society together around. So I I appreciate the work that you're doing greatly and hope that it can be something that becomes central to a public policy discourse. And I do believe there are a few bright spots in the US around that. There is, I've heard at one point at least, a committee in the state legislature in California on happiness.
Maryland has a an alternative indicator of progress at the state level about how the state is doing well-being wise. It's not highly publicized, but it's there. The state of Vermont has done a little work on happiness, not a surprise. Um, but so yeah, there are glimmers. There are glimmers. And another place is Kansas City. They have a Kansas City Well-Being Index. So there are pockets. There are pockets of even state level interest. There's not really federal level interest. You know, I think we're going to end up backing into it because of the concerns about youth mental health. I think that's, you know, some my kids, one of the three crawled backwards, and she's the medical student now. So, you know, don't have to, you don't always have to get there the expected way. And I think the U.S. right now, particularly because it's so divided and all kinds of stuff, is probably going to have to back into this. But, you know, if they'll, and I doubt I'll be alive when it happens, but that would be a great outcome if we all of a sudden it becomes kind of just a normal part of our public policy.
Thank you for the additional spotlights there of where that's taking place. And for your work, what kind of twists and turns do you hope to take with it?
Well, again, I try and combine work on despair, which is really needed right now because the deaths of despair have now spread to minorities and younger people. So I think I'm doing some serious tracking of what's happening with mortality traits and how those link to trends in subjective well-being. And then the other is trying to understand, um, as we've been talking about, how can you nurture hope and also try and recover it in populations that have lost it? I think we have pockets of examples, but we're far from, I don't think there's one magic bullet solution, but, ways that we can build it into our normal policy operations from schools to what local governments do, and at least have the federal government kind of be supportive and can maybe create some sort of, the UK and Japan and other countries have like ministries of loneliness, which, and I can't see us doing that, but having, a department or section of the Department of Health and Human Services that focuses on well-being, right? Which, if anything, just doesn't need to be expensive. It becomes almost a repository. So when other states, for example, want to initiate things like California has or Maryland has, or local communities where a lot of the work happens right now, can look at examples in other places and, decide which one would work in their community as opposed to just starting over. And so we have a lot of little startups, and most people don't know about the other things going on. And so I think that's just like a simple thing. The federal government could just play a coordination mechanism. There are lots of ways we can make progress.
Carol, thank you so much for being a guest on Positivity Matters. Is there anything else you'd like to share with people that may listen to this?
No, I'm not a how-to kind of person on this. I'm a boring scholar that I want to, identify robust patterns and maybe what we can do about them to change, but I'm not in the business of telling people how to be hopeful or how to be happy. But I think even the things you lay out, having people know about this stuff, they can pick and choose for themselves what is missing in their lives or what they'd like to emphasize. And I think even knowing that, understanding what the trends are and that, for example, more and more people people make a lot of bad consumption choices, always under the assumption that, if you buy a bigger house or a nicer car, it's going to bring you all this happiness. And, that happiness lasts about a day. Like the happiness boosts of buying a new car lasts about a week. Then you're just driving your car to work like you were before. Unfortunately, the happiness boost of getting married also lasts about 18 months, and then you go back to your original levels of happiness. But happier people are more likely to marry each other. That's where you get the marriage and happiness correlation. But anyway, so I think it's just people being aware that this, as you say, it's a real thing. There are actually scholars and scientists and whatever involved in trying to understand this, and that it's an important part of our health and, productivity, longevity. I think people will start to pick up on it themselves.